Hello and welcome back to Stefan's video, read by me, an AI text-to-speech reader that narrates what Stefan, as author, has laid out. This is the second of two presentations on Yugoslavia's integrity in relation to post-World War II leader, Josip Broz Tito, and his position. We ask, was Yugoslavia, honestly, held together by Tito? Or is this, a retrofitted, myth? Crafted by post-1990s pro-Western historians and journalists. The last presentation explored Yugoslavism as a concept, and how vast the ideology was, within which had been the same political spectrum as any other country. We looked at the pre-packaged excuses given by people for why the country fragmented, and why it is held that Tito, quote-unquote, held it together. The focus of the earlier recording had been the time leading up to the rise of Tito, whereas this presentation looks at his time in office, and the aftermath, to see whether Tito, in situ, equals unified state, and Tito, out of the equation, means the country collapses. So, after World War II, a geopolitical rift began to grow between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, with Yugoslavia supporting the communist insurgency in Greece, bypassing Moscow in the process. Between 1946 and 1948, Yugoslavia had been in negotiation with Albania to form an enlarged sovereign union, despite Yugoslavia meaning South Slavs, while Albanians are not Slavic. Similarly, there were talks between Tito and his Bulgarian counterpart, Georgi Dimitrov, about possibly uniting, which had been plausible, as, unlike Albanians, Bulgarians do happen to be South Slavic, as the word Yugoslav entails. Similarly, they discussed forming a federation whereby they maintain individual sovereignty, while having their own customs union. Eventually, Stalin persuaded Dimitrov and Enver Hoxha of Albania not to become this greater Yugoslavia, fearing that with the extra portion of northern Greece in the event of a communist victory in the Greek Civil War, that this potentially large entity might be free of Soviet influence. Tito had flirted with the possibility of an enlarged Yugoslav or, quote-unquote, Balkan Federation, but he had to settle for Yugoslavia almost its pre-war borders, by the time he and Stalin fell out, going their separate ways, and in consequence, Yugoslavia being expelled from Cominform, ruling Yugoslavia, out of future unions, such as the Warsaw Pact. It is curious, because the change of direction by the Bulgarian and Albanian leaders was not welcomed by everybody at home, and there were those who favored being part of a larger local Yugoslav or Balkan Federation, rather than allied to Moscow. These included, among others, Albanian Deputy Prime Minister, Koçi Dzodzi, who would be executed over his position in 1949, and Vasil Kolarov, who had been chairman of the Provincial Presidency of Bulgaria. Though, where proponents of Yugoslavia having been glued together by Tito are concerned, it is not important which outsiders had wanted to attach themselves to Yugoslavia, so much as whether any Yugoslavs had opposed Tito in his dispute with Stalin, and would have preferred Yugoslavia to be pro-Soviet, and not divorced from the Soviet Union. And these were plenty. Just as across the former Eastern Bloc, the communist parties would end up consolidating power, albeit differently country by country, Yugoslavia was no exception. Covered in the previous recording, had been the rarely explored, democratic federal Yugoslavia and its transition in 1945 to the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. This marks a period of slow suffocation for the multitude of Yugoslav parties to have existed in pre-World War II Yugoslavia, until only the KPJ was left. Before you condemn this as undemocratic, beware of two things. First, communist parties were all banned in the decades leading to World War II within the countries where they would come to power, and just about every leader of a communist government after World War II was at some point arrested, detained or imprisoned by the so-called democratic apparatus, to the point that some were only released by force after a Soviet incursion. Secondly, as will be explored in future, despite there being no voting for leaders in Western-style, quote-unquote, liberal democracies, there did happen to be citizen participation schemes whereby people did have a say over their own lives, but these are rarely mentioned in mainstream reporting, and misrepresented when they are. By the end of 1945, every coalition and individual party associated with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was out of harm's way for the communists. In 1949, a prison camp was opened on an island called Goliotok, for male dissidents to the Tito-led government. It was operational right until 1989. In the first few years alone, that is 1949 to 1956, the Cominform period, the number of persons sent to the Goliotok labor camp for rehabilitation, which could have meant torture, and in many places, murdered, was estimated at a whopping 12 to 15,000. These included pro-Soviet Yugoslavs of all Yugoslav ethnicities, and at all levels of political life prior to their arrest. The most famous example had been the Croatian Andrija Hebrang, for this is the person tipped to have been Stalin's prime candidate if Tito could ever be eliminated. Hebrang, who had been fourth secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Croatia, was blacklisted from the party, then arrested by the UDBA, Yugoslavia's Directorate for State Security, and is believed to have been killed by Yugoslav authorities in 1949 while in a Belgrade prison cell, but this remains fuzzy, as the details of his time and cause of death were largely held back, and likely distorted. But the fact remains, that through the Tito-Stalin split by itself, pro-Yugoslav ideological opposition to Tito existed, divorced now entirely from the political machinery to have existed in Kingdom of Yugoslavia.
Right, so, the narrator of the 1995 BBC documentary titled, The Death of Yugoslavia, actually says in the opening lines, that Tito held Yugoslavia together. He died in 1980, and it took just 11 years for Slovenia and Croatia to break away. The BBC is a true paragon of sound and unbiased reporting. As such, by my calculation, if this, Hebrang or however you say his name, should have ousted Tito in 1948, then with the rise of ethnic and religious tension, Yugoslavia should have split up by 1959.
Interestingly, 1950, in parts of western Bosnia and over the border into the Croatian hinterland witnessed the peasants' revolt, multi-ethnic in nature with a Muslim majority, but smaller numbers of Serbian and Croatian peasants. These people had been suffering from a drought, brought on by the collectivization of the communist system. The movement was largely spontaneous and without proper coordination, appearing to know what it did, not like, that being, communist rule, be that pro or anti-Soviet, but little in the way of the alternatives they were seeking. The rebellion was crushed, resulting in about 30 deaths and more than 700 arrests over the two-day period of the 5th and 6th of May, 1950. But to rally support when the rebels had hoped their mutiny would spread, two of its leaders were promising that the ousted Kingdom of Yugoslavia would be restored, with the London-based monarchy brought out of exile. The point being, a multi-ethnic rebellion, and still not anti-Yugoslav sentiment. From this, we now move to the dynamic of post-World War II Yugoslavia. Tito was the president. He hired, and he fired. He was not, however, responsible for the economic model, if such thing had been the magical spell to, quote-unquote, hold people together. That accolade belonged to Tito ally, the Slovenian Edvard Kardelj, who in his time, held multiple roles both in central government, and the Slovenian presidency for Yugoslavia. As an economist, he had been the main person to create the workers' self-management system. This was one of many systems across the Eastern Bloc, a sector labeled quote-unquote, authoritarian, in the West, and by the detractors of communist rule among locals, which was formulated to incorporate direct citizen participation at local or communal level, without competitive national elections, but with greater local responsiveness. Regrettably, Kardelj died in 1979, 1 year before Tito, which meant that the model he had been working towards and improving his whole life, was stopped short of perfection. It has later been analyzed that the type of model that Kardelj was hoping to achieve had been similar to what Libya was to become when Gaddafi created 1,500 communes for the communities to vote directly on administrative affairs. Not even Edvard Kardel himself should take full credit for the model he helped create. In the early years of the endeavor, he was helped largely by fellow Slovenian Boris Kidrič. Yet throughout the time of Tito-led Yugoslavia, people who influenced the structure of Yugoslavia came and went. The life of Boris Kidrič was tragically cut short in 1953 when at just 41 years old, he succumbed to leukemia. But the question is, particularly for those to promote the narrative that Tito supposedly held Yugoslavia together, what difference was Tito's death supposed to make? On the one hand, there had been those who shaped policy who died during Tito's lifetime. I mentioned Kardel, Kidrič, and I can also add Bosnian Muslim Jamal Bijedić, Prime Minister of Yugoslavia from 1971 until tragically losing his life in a plane crash in 1977. The first takeaway from the claim of Tito having held the country together while president, and Yugoslavia falling apart after he died, is that if there were any truth to this, then Tito might just have seen this happen. His death happened on the 4th of May 1980. However, his health had been deteriorating for the past years, and he made no public appearances after 1979. In January 1980, his health took a turn for the worse, and he became functionally incapacitated. Particularly after his leg amputation on January the 20th. All running of affairs were now devolved to the collective presidency which rotated annually, meaning that the man in charge of the country had become Lazar Kolishevsky, of Macedonia. Ceremonially, Tito had still been president, as his title was, President for Life, but between January and May, he merely listened to briefings on symbolic matters, while all heavy lifting was carried out by the collective presidency. The inner circle and the foreign diplomatic corps already knew that Tito was no longer steering the country. His death thereby changed nothing. Just as many who shaped the nation had died before Tito, others who were actively responsible for the model of Yugoslavia at the time of Tito's death, continued their efforts in the years after he died. The Croatian communist leader Vladimir Bakaric was one of the most influential figures in the Yugoslav political hierarchy, from the end of World War II, right until his death in 1983. The internal problems which Yugoslavia faced after Tito's death, such as the 1981 Kosovo demonstrations, often pitched as the event which led to the permanent isolation of Kosovo's Albanian majority from the Yugoslav state, and the country now showing the first cracks in its integrity after Tito had died were in essence no different to the internal problems Yugoslavia experienced when Tito was alive. I refer to the student protests across Belgrade, Zagreb and Ljubljana in June 1968. Sticking with Kosovo, there had been the Treća miners' strikes of 1970. In Bosnia and in Macedonia, there had been agricultural price protests in 1969 and 1970. Going back further, in 1950 there had been the tobacco workers' protest of Herzegovina, that is the southern part of the Bosnia and Herzegovina Republic. Plus there had been the Croatian Spring between 1967 and 1971, in addition to the previously mentioned Peasants' Revolt of 1950. But somehow, the Kosovo protests of 1981 are sold as the quote-unquote first cracks after Tito's death, despite the demands neither having been triggered by any post-Tito amendment, nor calling for the return of privileges to have once existed, and nor was this chapter bigger, nor more disruptive than other events to take place in Tito's lifetime, none of which were framed as quote-unquote cracks in unity.
The affairs of this part of the world are just complicated.
At this point I will aver the following. Whenever a YouTuber, Western reporter, historian, armchair pundit or other self-anointed expert tries to sell the notion that Tito had held Yugoslavia together, he operates on the basis that Yugoslavia was inherently fractious, and that it needed holding together, despite nothing mentioned yet, nor anything in the earlier recording focusing on 1918 to 1945 showing this to be the case. The $6 billion question is, did Yugoslavia implode from within? Or did somebody help it along the way? Was the fragmentation inevitable? Or was it skillfully coordinated? And where was the collective West during this whole period? stood somewhere else minding its own business with its hands in its pockets? Or was it up to its neck in having sown discord among the nations? The commentators in question who sell the Tito held Yugoslavia together theory, invariably, never broach the question of whether the West had a hand in the fragmentation. Note, why I avoid the terms, break up, or collapse, will be explored shortly. You can be certain that such video creators tacitly sing the praises of the West, as though NATO and the European Union are some shining city on the hill, and you can be certain that they will never mention 99% of subjects raised in these recordings up to this point. But to adumbrate the MO of the armchair pundits,
4 out of 6 republics broke away between 1991 and 1992. Tito died in 1980. The country survived as long as it did, without breaking up. Now let's fit the events into a prefabricated narrative.
To pause for thought. This author has no intention of deeply exploring the role played by the West in the fragmentation of Yugoslavia, because that information is already out there, and is easily accessible. You won't find such a confession from Sky News, or in the Washington Post, but they will occasionally blurt the quiet bit out loud. Though whether they do or not, anyone familiar with the 1980s and 1990s in Yugoslavia and its breakaways, will not rely on the occasional Freudian slip from a Western regime figure, nor an unintended soundbite from mainstream reporter. The author did not make these recordings to regurgitate what has already been said by many. However, you will realize that the events of the period in question will immediately appear not complicated after you realize that Ronald Reagan's NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, issued a blueprint specifically for Yugoslavia, its plans for every republic, and more importantly, after Yugoslavia. The document in question, long having been leaked, is easy to obtain for anybody in 2025. For the record, the NED is Washington's so-called democracy branding cudgel, nominally independent, but funded entirely by the U.S. Congress. It was founded in 1983 to outsource regime change functions that the CIA used to carry out more secretly, especially in any country from whose economy the Wall Street bankers were earning absolute nix. But just before continuing, this author intends to create a presentation based on the West's involvement in the events across the rest of the socialist bloc from the late 1980s, as, unlike Yugoslavia, this area is not so vastly explored. In brief, an evisceration of the Western narrative does not just stop at Yugoslavia, while the West is, all of a sudden, correct in its sanitized triumphalist narrative of changes across the socialist bloc. Supposedly, all having been some simultaneous realization that people wanted democracy, and communism had collapsed. Cue the revolutions, etc. All of these lazy tropes will be laid bare. From East Germany, to the end of the Soviet Union. Now to return to Yugoslavia. To quickly summarize a catalogue of the Western involvement which brought about the changes in Yugoslavia from the early 1990s, these are not restricted to the NED. There had also been coordinated interference from both the World Bank and the IMF, which exacerbated a financial crisis. Plus, funding of anti-federal and opposition to national unity groups from the United States Agency for International Development. Also, the creation of reform projects aimed at aligning with the Western liberal economic and political agenda by George Soros and the precursor to his Open Society foundations. Then, Radio Free Europe broadcasting in the Yugoslav languages, amplifying anti-federal leaders, and assisting Western policymakers. Next, the European Community's so-called democracy assistance programs, selectively offering aid to whichever republic resisted Belgrade's federal line. Then, the CIA and allied intelligence services supporting dissidents in the diaspora, weaponizing economic tension to invent ethnic discord. There had been the contributions of German political foundations Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, providing training, printing equipment, and connections to the regime in West Germany. And most of all, political party training, polling, campaign strategy, direct political engineering, by both National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. There were other examples from other agencies, but as I said, there is ample coverage to all of this. Feel free to research it for yourselves. A recap of the claim. The death of Tito putatively reignited long-suppressed religious and ethnic hatred, because while Tito was alive, he decentralized administrative powers to 8 entities, 6 with republic status, and 2 with autonomous province status within an existing republic, but all 8 of them functioned equally within this framework. So, what do those people who claim Tito held it together mean when claiming the return of ethnic religious hatred?
Well, the Slovenes and Croats were Christian Catholics, the Serbs, Macedonians and Montenegrins were Christian Orthodox, and the Muslims were just Muslim. These people have a history of wars and mutual hatred.
Do they indeed? Then how about Albanians as a nation, dispersed among various countries? They too have Muslims and Christians, while those Christians in some areas have a Catholic majority, while in others, a majority who are adherents to the Albanian Orthodox Church. Now, Albanian society may be divided down many lines, but religion, it seems, sure isn't one of them. What happened then to years of wars and mutual hatred?
It's complicated, I guess.
Again, the fallback trope, complicated.
Hey, I just remembered. Albania can't have these problems because the republic is secular.
Secular it is. From having been officially atheist before 1992. But in communist Yugoslavia, religion was not banned outright so much as it was discouraged. The hardest times to be practicing faith had been the 1940s and the 1950s. Thereafter, things incrementally grew softer and softer, while the death of Tito marks no significant moment in the restoration of religious freedom. Secular, Albania may be, but so is Slovenia, and Bosnia, and Serbia, and Montenegro, Croatia, and Macedonia, for that matter. Apart from religion having played no part in any republic's secession, the notion that all ex-Yugoslav republics are secular is a bristling departure from long-standing religious hatred. For the record, yes, religious differences did surface for a time during the actual fighting in the 1990s. But the reasons why, and by whom, this was induced, is the subject of a presentation focusing on the wars themselves. The focus here is whether Tito held Yugoslavia together. So, what else supposedly made the republics look sideways at continued unity after Tito died?
Tito dies, the country starts borrowing, Yugoslavia goes into economic freefall, and the economy collapses. The industrious republics are dragged down, so they have no choice but to heroically break free from socialist mismanagement. Slovenia and Croatia were the richest republics, having to carry the poorer south, such as Macedonia and autonomous province of Kosovo. Hyperinflation, literally, drove the breakup.
Reality check time. First, what caused Yugoslavia to have to borrow, and just how big was the country's debt?
2. Oil crises. The first crisis in 1973, and the second in 1979. As a non-oil producing nation, Yugoslavia was hit hard by spiking oil prices, leading to higher import costs and balance of payments deficits. To cover these, Yugoslavia borrowed from Western banks, often at floating interest rates. So, in the 1970s, Yugoslavia took on loans, but with strings attached, especially after the 1973 oil shock. These came with conditions that would look familiar to any African country. Cut subsidies, devalue currency, freeze wages, and open markets to foreign capital. Yugoslavia's debt soared to $20 billion by 1980, the highest in the socialist bloc.
The 1970s. In other words, if hyperinflation from borrowing drove the so-called breakup, then the wind was sown on Tito's watch. The borrowing is said to have happened in the 1970s, the amount owed having stood at $20 billion in 1980, the year Tito died. This would cast yet another cloud over the hypothesis that Tito held the country together, if indeed hyperinflation caused the fragmentation, but we will come to whether it did or not, shortly. But before anybody start entertaining fantasies that this was all some collapse of communism or socialism, here is the first lesson for you. Yes, other socialist economies did succumb to problems caused by the oil crises, these being Poland, Hungary, and Romania. And all three borrowed from Western banks as a response. However, this does not mean every country with a communist government. Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia were not on that list. A little known fact coming up, because it is heavily ignored in Western coverage as it frustrates the West's talking points on the Eastern Bloc. Romania, whose economy had grown considerably from after World War II up to the mid-1970s, had entered a period of a slowdown in economic growth after the chapter in question. The austerity from the mid-1970s for the rest of the communist period in Romania had been down to Ceausescu having serviced the debt so effectively, that by the time he and his wife were assassinated on December 25, 1989, Romania was almost debt-free. Yet unlike for Romania, Hungary, and Poland, here we might be able to see the first pitfall of Tito's slap in the face to the Soviet Union and Stalin decades earlier. The Warsaw Pact countries, to borrow, did not quite feel the squeeze that Yugoslavia experienced. This had been for a few reasons. First, the response to debt differed. The debts of the Warsaw Pact III were controlled by Comecon, of which Yugoslavia could not be a member, and so Yugoslavia remained exposed to Western conditionality. The Warsaw Pact countries had a fixed rate which they could pay in rubles, while Yugoslavia was forced to pay in hard currency, namely dollars. In 1982, Yugoslavia defaulted. And here is where IMF sabotage becomes plain as a pikestaff. Billed in Western media as a rescuer, its conditions were devastating. First, the IMF demanded a sharp devaluation of the dinars, Yugoslavia's currency. This made the debt more expensive to service in dinar terms. The IMF insisted on capping wage growth below inflation to quote-unquote improve competitiveness. In reality, real wages fell by about 25% between 1982 and 1985, eroding living standards and fueling labor unrest. To supposedly slow inflation, the IMF ordered credit tightening. This meant that state enterprises couldn't modernize, unemployment grew, and industrial output stagnated. The opening to foreign competition then pressured Yugoslavia to lower barriers for Western imports, and in consequence, domestic factories, especially in less developed republics, couldn't compete, feeding regional economic disparities. Why then does this look like sabotage? If the IMF had truly wanted to stabilize Yugoslavia without breaking it apart, it could have first restructured debt repayments over a longer horizon without severe austerity. Second, allowed wage growth to match inflation, particularly to avoid social unrest. And third, supported targeted investment in less developed regions to keep the federation balanced. And fourth, maintained key subsidies to protect the poorest households while phasing in reforms gradually. Instead, the IMF's little, one-size-fits-all, shock therapy hit Yugoslavia harder than any other borrower at the time, precisely because the federation's social fabric was tied to economic guarantees. But there is one giant enigma here. The harshest blows fell on the poorer south, namely Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia, and parts of Montenegro, deepening regional grievances the West would later frame as ethnic rather than economic. A trope you have to question, when you consider that it had been the wealthier republics, Slovenia and Croatia, who both felt the pinch of the debts the least, yet sprinted for the exit the fastest. This now is what is ignored in Western coverage, and by every commentator in the nihilism of Western involvement in Yugoslavia's eventual fragmentation, who instead hide behind the mantra of Tito holding the country together. Unlike Romania from the mid-1970s, Yugoslavia's economy grew not only after World War II, but up to the point that territories broke away. The per capita gross national product had doubled in the decade and a half after the borrowing had begun, meaning that in 1990, Yugoslavia was ranked 21st, ahead of economies such as South Africa, Finland, Norway, and Hong Kong. As regards persons addressing grievances from Slovenia and Croatia regarding their status as the wealthiest republics, allegedly being quote-unquote, bled dry, there appears never to be mention that Slovenia and Croatia had been the largest beneficiaries of internal Yugoslav trade, shared infrastructure, and a protected domestic market. And finally, the big question of whether hyperinflation caused the so-called breakup. Runaway inflation had reached its worst in 1989. From that same year, the federal Prime Minister Ante Marković revised much of the crisis. So what did Marković do?
Yugoslav Prime Minister Ante Marković introduced a shock stabilization program that slashed hyperinflation from around 1,200% to near single digits in under 1 year. The dinar became temporarily convertible, with a stable exchange rate. Industrial output recovered, and foreign investors showed interest again. And the GDP growth resumed across the poorer parts of the country.
By the time Croatia and Slovenia declared independence on the 25th of June 1991, hyperinflation had long been yesterday's headlines, to the point that for the first 3 months, both nations continued to use the dinar, issued by the National Bank of Yugoslavia, until their replacement currencies began to be phased in. Such a notion is worlds removed from hyperinflation causing the so-called breakup, and the currency being worthless. Ergo, the hyperinflation theory, stemming from borrowing while Tito was alive, compounded by the International Monetary Fund, and resolved by the end of 1990, did not ignite ethnic hatred, and was not a reason any republic left the Union. Now early on in the previous recording, we looked at the usual stockpile of apologetics that ignoramuses give when claiming Tito held Yugoslavia together, one of the most common assertions being that Tito devolved power to all the regions, in other words, appeasing the locals. But when it came to the suggestion of those locals being mutually hostile, and not wanting to live with each other, we are reminded that Tito is a dictator, whereby you're not allowed to voice your thoughts. Here is where the amateur has overshot the runway. Simple formula. Country able to fall apart unless Tito meets everybody's demands, means Tito was not in control. Therefore, breakup is every bit possible for those not willing to live in the same state as the others. Tito, being in control, would simply have no obligation to hand powers to local administrations. If he did so because he was feeling generous, then the fact would remain, the president giveth, and the president taketh. Blessed be the name. So which was it? The recurring theme of ideological difference in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had been centralization versus decentralization, with the pro-centralization parties and coalitions having come out on top. Notwithstanding the interruptions of World War II, this system did not collapse, but became ousted by the rivaling communist apparatus. Within communist Yugoslavia, the centralization trend was reversed, as power was outsourced from central government to local regions. But the story as many know it, begins in 1966. For the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, even within the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, had been a wide spectrum of politicians with varying positions on how power should be distributed, with many believing that most, if not all of it, should be left to the federal authorities, and not the republics. One high-profile example had been the Serbian communist Aleksandar Ranković. Ranković was a close Tito ally, and had led the country's original secret police at the time of its inception, and held many government posts in the years that followed. If you read about Ranković today, he will be caricatured as a Serbian nationalist within Yugoslavia, even though to have been one would have never seen him join the KPJ, let alone be one of Tito's 4 vice presidents in the collective presidency. The Ranković as Serb nationalist line was manufactured in the 1990s and 2000s to retrofit him into a Serb versus non-Serb narrative. That label is entirely a post-Yugoslav invention, applied retroactively by Western-leaning academics and media to fit the later, ancient ethnic hatreds, script. In his own time, the disputes were framed in centralization versus decentralization terms. Rankovic was purged in 1966, but avoided Goliotic, and retired to a quiet life in Dubrovnik for the remainder of his life, passing away in 1983. While living in Dubrovnik, he received occasional visits from old comrades, suggesting no enemy of the state stigma, just political sidelining. Rankovic openly advocated for centralizing power, not for some imagined Serbian influence as latter-day commentators claim. His position was supported by Bosnian Muslim communist politician Jamal Bijedić, and Montenegrin Croatian Vlado Popović. His centralist viewpoints were not the reason for his fall from grace. The official accusation was abuse of security services, illegal wiretapping, including surveillance of Tito himself, and others. Upon Tito purging Rankovic, came an impetuous reaction from Tito to ensure nothing like this ever happens again, and as such, Tito doubled down in handing administrative powers to the 8 entities to compose the country, which would all culminate in the 1974 constitution. Just how much power was handed to the republics and autonomous provinces will be the subject for discussion in the next presentation, as I don't wish to give anything away at this stage. One thing I will share, however, is that the post-Rankovic amendments involved the breaking down even of the State Security Service, the UDBA, into regional branches, everybody now responsible for his own secret policing. The irony here is, no republic really asked for this, but was given this as a cautionary measure by Tito, in defiance of the policies of a trusted ally who betrayed him. Now if anybody still believes that Tito was quote-unquote, holding the country together, then such person must logically believe that post-Rankovic from 1966, Tito still held power. To explore this theory, I leave you with the following reflection, as we fast forward to the 1970s. By the mid-1970s, relations between a certain high-profile lady and parts of the national political elite, particularly within the League of Communists and the UDBA, had badly deteriorated. She was accused, though never formally charged, of political scheming, cultivating her own circle of influence, and interfering in state affairs, which alarmed powerful figures close to Tito. I refer to none other than Jovanka Broz, third and current wife of President Tito. In 1977, UDBA began systematic surveillance of Jovanka. Tito was aging, and his health declining, and the succession question loomed large. Jovanka was suspected of trying to influence succession and policy. Her movements were restricted, security personnel around her were replaced, and she was gradually cut off from public appearances. From 1977 until Tito's death in 1980, Jovanka lived in virtual house arrest in a guarded villa in Belgrade. She was isolated from friends and family, her mail censored, and her access to Tito heavily limited. Therefore, if something did hold Yugoslavia together, then it was collective self-interest, and not Tito's personal governance. When you consider that Tito's own wife was taken to one side by the UDBA, then the UDBA was loyal to some form of structure above Tito himself. Now knowing this, and seeing the geopolitical shockwaves across the Eastern Bloc between 1989 and 1991, I can safely deduce that whether Tito died in 1980, 1966 or 1952, the country was sure to outlast his will, because for the last 14 years of his life, his rule was purely ceremonial. Similarly, had Tito been younger and in better health, and healthy enough to govern for 10 more years or longer, and had Tito survived the sweeping changes across the rest of the socialist bloc, then Tito would have been the only long-standing president to survive the revolutions. Romania's Ceausescu fell. Bulgaria's Todor Zhivkov fell. Every other communist leader fell, in short order. Now in the late 1980s, there was indeed a chain of events which did result in republics breaking away from Yugoslavia, and we will turn these inside out in the next presentation, but for now, I leave you with one thought. Tito, sure as shit, did not hold Yugoslavia together. Stay well. Until next time.